Death at Bishop's Keep. Chapter 43. Any discriminating diner will attest to the truth of the old adage, the proof of the pudding is in the eating of it. Miss Barnstable, Kitchen Cookery, 1872. Charles had no difficulty finding his way below stairs. As he went, he brooded upon the look in Miss Ardley's eyes when she had spoken back to him, alternating between fire and chill, and the urgent touch of her fingers on his arm. But she had no cause to challenging her, he told himself, feeling wounded. He had withheld his idea only to keep from causing her pain. In fact, no other woman he knew would have attacked him in so headstrong a fashion when he was simply trying to spare her. Women, they were either fragile and fainting, or viragos. Being an American and Irish, Miss Ardley belonged, doubtless, in the latter category, although he had thought it possible before he came this afternoon. He shook his head, perplexed. He did not know what he had thought exactly. He had certainly not planned to develop yesterday's photographs in such a haste, nor to make a special call to bring them to her today. But since the luncheon was less than 24 hours ago, her image had imposed itself persistently upon his thoughts. Her russet flyaway hair, her mouth that could be sternly sober and inviting by turns, her steady hazel green eyes, her quick wit. He quickened his own pace. Well, if he had been attracted to the women yesterday, he was saved from fatal error by having met the Spitfire today. He straightened his shoulders, recalling himself the task at hand. Miss Ardley was, after all, an altogether unsuitable person for any serious. He did not complete the thought, being distracted by the sight. In the passageway outside the servants' hall of 5 people. The butler, the parlour-maid, the groom, and 2 girls in grey stuff dresses with pinafores were leaning or sitting against the wall, arms folded, faces variously impassive, nervous, and in the case of the 2 girls, frightened. The cook, Charles concluded, must be with Constable Lakin in the servants' hall. Constable Lakin, Edward Lakin, Ned. It had been years since Charles had seen him, for their lives had taken very different ways. But the name opened an album of memories as bright and clear as any photograph. The warm summer days, 2 carefree boys had spent lazing under fragrant hayricks, swimming in the deep, cool waters of River Stour, stalking the wild mushroom through gloomy woods below East Berkholt. The wild mushroom. Fungi were less of an interest to Charles now than they had been when he and Ned Lakin were 12. Ned had wanted to be chief of Scotland Yard when he grew up, and Charles had planned to be the world's greatest mycologist. His juvenile ambitions along that line had been encouraged by his grandfather, a connoisseur of mushrooms who taught him to recognize the marvelous variety to be found in the woods and fields around East Berkholt. That was a long time ago, and his grandfather was dead. But Charles still remembered what he had learned from the old man. From Catherine Ardley's descriptions of the fatal symptoms, he had a very clear notion of what had caused the death of her aunts. Charles went past the waiting group of servants, feeling their eyes on him, and into the kitchen. It was an ordinary kitchen, high-ceilinged and draughty, and no doubt the devil to work in. The only light came from a high window on one wall and a fire in the fireplace. A heavy coal range stood in one corner, with a simmering pot of soup at the back. On the table covered with a cloth were dishes for luncheon, if anyone had thought to eat it, a roast joint, a cheese, sliced tomatoes, and cucumbers. The sideboard was stacked with pots and bowls and empty of foodstuffs, with the exception of the spices that were used in the daily food preparation. Charles looked around. Where the blazes did they store the food? He went to a door in the wall and opened it. It led through a short passageway to the outside, but off to the right was a pantry with shelves for produce, root vegetables, and the like. It smelled of onions and faintly of something else, of damp earth and rotted wood. It was dark. Very dark. Charles returned to the kitchen and found a candle on the mantel. He lighted it at the fire and returned to the storeroom to search the shelves, starting at the top. On the floor at the back, in the willow basket covered with a damp cloth, he found what he was looking for. He sniffed appreciatively. The earthy scene brought back the memory of walks with his grandfather through the autumn forest. Gently, one at a time, Charles took the mushrooms out of the basket, examining each and placing it in its proper pile. Judging from the great variety, he thought, they had been collected in the woods rather than in a mushroom house. The most numerous by far were the common field mushroom, Agaricus campestris, whose smooth grey-white tops and pink gills had a clean, crisp look. Beside these, Charles placed the horse mushrooms, which had the same rounded shape but were much larger, with greyish gills rather than pink. Next to these he piled several velvety buff-coloured specimens of Lepiste Sevier and a handful of Lepiste Nude, also known as blue cap, not to be eaten uncooked, but pleasantly aromatic when properly sautéed. He also found a few satiny yellowed Cantharellus cibera, which seemed to him to smell of apricots, and one large Hypnum rufensis, the wood hedgehog, not frequently collected owing to the skill required to cook it without bitterness. But it was not until Charles reached the very bottom of the basket that he found, with almost no surprise, what he was looking for. One large and marvellously healthy specimen of Amanita phalloides, the death cap. Admiring, he held the lethal toadstool in his hand for a moment, thinking what an extraordinary beautiful specimen it was, how pearly its soft flesh, how perfect the fan of its radiating gills, how delicate the circumference of the vulva that still embraced the lower stem. Such a glorious specimen, and yet so lethal. He wondered briefly if the other had been this perfect, since it was his hypothesis that there had been at least one A. phalloides in the pudding. Charles gently placed the toadstool on the table, so then assumed that there had been two, and presumed innocence. Someone who did not know his mushrooms had accidentally included two phalloides among the variegated assemblage of edible fungi in the basket. He frowned. That seemed doubtful, however, because of the presence of A. rufensis, which was usually collected only by a mushroom connoisseur with sufficient knowledge to ensure its proper preparation, which led to the conclusion that the person who collected two A. phalloides did so with deadly intent, a defensible conclusion, but difficult to prove. Or set aside for the moment the motive of the collector, and search instead for the intention of the one who had prepared the deadly pudding. Given a basket of edible mushrooms which included, either by accident or design, two or more fatal fungi, the cook should have recognized and quickly discarded the intruders, unless of course the cook were inexperienced or incompetent, or inspired by a deadly intent to slice it up and add it to the pudding. Charles stood up. He shook out his handkerchief and placed it in the splendid specimen of A. phalloides and tenderly tied the corners into a bundle, which he then pocketed. It was time to look into the preparation of the mushroom pudding.